Good day, everybody. Welcome to the series on aspiring NEDs, and it's also for new non-executives as well. And Mervyn, very good morning to you. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Obviously, we're going to be chatting to you a lot about your experience over many years, and I, for one, have learned so much from you since joining the King Committee in 1999. Can't even count how many years it is now. But I know you go back many years before that. Just to introduce today's session, we're going to be discussing really global trends in governance. We're going to look at pitfalls, lessons learned, particularly from Professor King's experience, and also how integrated reporting is critical for corporate directors to lead responsible businesses. And we've seen a lot of that in the last 2.5 years, and the change, really, that sort of cultural shift now post the pandemic and during the pandemic. So as I'm sure you all know, Professor King founded the King Committee. He's also been a very avid supporter of the Institute of Directors, senior counsel, former judge, and obviously, as we all know, an experienced non-executive director and a board chairman. He has honorary doctorates of law from the universities of Witwatersrand and Leeds, and as I've mentioned, he was involved with the King Committee and is chairman emeritus of the King Committee on Corporate Governance in South Africa. As you're all aware, the King Committee has produced Kings 1, 2, 3, and 4, and he was also a first vice president of the Institute of Directors of South Africa. So Mervyn, let's get on into the session proper. And obviously we're very keen to hear your experience over these many years. And I suppose just to start off with, just for this audience, how do you see the role and the expectations of a non-executive director? So there's a bit of history to that. And then also now how things have changed in the last 2.5 years and how those roles have now morphed into something quite different based on what we saw during the pandemic.
Well, one must remember that a director is a director. Neither the Common Law nor the Companies Act talks about non-executive directors and executive directors. So every director has the same duties of care, good faith, skill and diligence. A non-executive director we have defined in business as a director who is not employed by contract by the company, but is a director which is a statutory appointment. And he signs a form which is filed with the CIPC. So when a director is employed by the company, an executive director, as we've called it in business, because he's an employee and he's a director, he's got a contract of employment and he's got a statutory appointment. Whereas a non-executive director is just a statutory appointment. But he's got the same duties of care, skill and diligence of the executive director. He brings to the table outside knowledge. He also starts seeing the wood for the trees, because he's not at the coalface every day as the executive director is. And one of the critical things of the non-executive director, after being inducted usually by the company secretary, is to ask what I call intellectually naive questions. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I don't understand this. I would like the chief executive to explain this to me. And really it starts the board thinking about certain things, because you get a new face coming in, new thinking coming in. And he's coming in from his experience. Maybe he wasn't in the industry before. And so he's bringing in new ideas and to ask new questions. But the non-executive director to be appointed is a two-way street, because the non-executive director spent, say, 40 years building his reputation and his expertise, which results in the shareholders of the company you're speaking about appointing him at a general meeting as a non-executive director. But likewise, he's got to do a due diligence of the company, because if the company has clouds hanging over its head because of certain things. Or he sees that J. Arthur Brown is sitting as a director. Well, he doesn't take the appointment. He's got to do an audit on the company and the people that he's going to sit with around the boardroom table, because they become a collective, a collegiate, and there is the collective mind of the board, and he will be identified with those collective mind decisions. So that's why I always start with the non-executive director saying, it's all very well you've been offered this, but have you done an audit of the company and the colleagues that you'll be sitting with? So the non-executive director, the aspirant non-executive director, has to be very careful with that.
And maybe just expanding on that a bit, so I joined the board now. It's my first year. There's a change in culture change in culture perceived by myself, because I'm now new to a whole group of individuals. Just in short, how do I navigate that first year?
Well, first of all, a lot's going to depend on the chairman's role. Is absolutely critical. And the chairman must be in control of that board. And a lot of chairmen don't control boards. And experience teaches one how to control a board and to get the best out of a board. The late Adrian Cadbury and I, back in the 90s, had huge discussions about the difference between the culture in a company and the characteristics of a company. So you, Anton, have a South African culture, but you've got characteristics. A company is a person in law. Culture, I like the American definition. It's how we do things around here when no one is watching us. So it's an internal thing, culture. But the external stakeholder has perceptions of the characteristics of the company. And one of the critical things that the non-executive director must do is ensure that the rest of the board, have actually gone offline, Bosberaad, famously called in South Africa, and actually decided what are these characteristics that are perceived by the external stakeholders. Because when we make a business judgment call, it better fit in with those characteristics. Because if they're inconsistent, then you start getting a different perception of the company as a good corporate citizen or not being a good corporate citizen. So the non-executive director arriving at a company can learn about the culture, but he should have a discussion with the chairman, if necessary with the whole board. Have you discussed the characteristics of this company? Because when I was joining, I saw this and I saw that, and I believed that, but now I found out this, I found out that. And so you know what the external stakeholders' perceptions are. And of course, you try and make a decision which is not inconsistent with that. Because if it is, then you've got to start changing your characteristics in your company, which is something maybe you've built up over 20 years or whatever it is.
Yep.
So there is a difference, and the non-executive director must be aware of this, and he must make sure that the company is dealt with it. If not, he should ask the chairman to have an offline meeting and actually discuss with all the directors. Because when you make that business judgment call, that collective mind decision, that you should all be singing from the same hymn sheet.
Thanks, Mervyn. And maybe on that point as well, if I'm new on a board, it's my first year, how do I ready myself? You spoke about due diligence, but how do I ready myself from a governance point of view? I mean, there's a myriad of requirements from a governance perspective. I often say to individuals, read Kings 1 right through to King 4, so you kind of get to understand how the governance codes have changed over the years, how they've matured, but besides that, and then also the regulatory environment that you need to have a fairly good handle on. What would you suggest to that director that's now entering a board for the first time to get to better understand the governance arena and obviously the regulatory requirements?
Well, he or she has to understand that there's been a mindset shift from 30 years ago. The dictate was that there was the primacy of the shareholder. So you focused on one stakeholder, had primacy over the other stakeholders. Now, in 1992, when I was asked by the IRD to set up this committee, and I actually spoke to Mr. Mandela about it at the time, and he said, "Do it, you're the right man." I had to do it, even though at the time I was chairman of two very large companies. It was the Frame Group and FNB, Corporate and Merchant Bank. And so my hands were full, and I was deciding whether I should do this or not. But anyway, I did it after chatting to Mr. Mandela. If you look at the first report, you'll see that the committee was made up truly of people representative of what became known as our Rainbow Nation. I knew that if we came out with a code of governance which was premised on the basis of the primacy of the shareholder, it would be seen in today's language as white monopolistic capital. So I wittingly steered my members of the committee, which, as I said, was representative of our new country, but had a couple of experienced directors on, and I had to steer them away from this idea, of making sure that you're increasing the wealth of the shareholders. And so we came out with, and it was the special circumstances. It wasn't any genius on my part, but it was to meet the special circumstances that I steered the committee away from the dictates at the time of how you govern a company. And we came out with the following, that the board should learn and understand the needs, interests, and expectations of the various stakeholder groupings pertinent to that business of that company, but then make a decision in the best long-term interest of the company. Because my argument was, and still is, that if you get it right, that long-term business judgment call, it's in the best long-term interest of all the stakeholders, and not just one. And it never ceases to fascinate me that was 1992, my thinking. And that thinking arose because I'd been a director and chairman of many companies by that stage. And I realized that actually this was wrong, to think of a focus on one stakeholder. And so it changed it. But it's very interesting to me that almost exactly what we said in King 1, last year, or was it the year before, just after the pandemic, the 100 Roundtable of America, the top 100 companies in America, said virtually the same thing, that we must look after the interests of all the stakeholders that look after the company. But they changed from the primacy of the shareholder. But it took from 1992 till 2021. And so it's also fascinating to me now. I was Chair Emeritus of the Value Reporting Foundation, which consolidated the International Integrated Reporting Council, of which I've been the chair, and also the International Sustainability Standards Board, which looked at sustainability from the outside in. And we merged that, called the Value Reporting Foundation. We eventually did a deal, put that into the IFRS. And so it's been fascinating for me. I mean, as late as yesterday, I was busy with something involving the IFRS. That the thinking at the IFRS, that they actually, a year ago, thought, no, ESG issues are critical to value, and that they, as one of the great standard setters in the world, with IASB, which we follow in this country, should have a sustainability arm standard. And so they formed the ISSB. So I'm using a lot of acronyms here, but International Sustainability Standards Board. And they took the SASB standards, which really was a focus of the three critical dimensions, the economy, society, and the environment, for sustainable development, and looked at how they impacted on companies. So they looked at, for example, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, how it affected the financial conditions of companies, their balance sheets, how it affected their operating, their income statements and their cash flows, affected their risk profile, their cost of capital. So the GRI, of which I've been the chairman for many years, we had looked at sustainability from the inside out. How did we make our product? How did we render our service? What were the outputs? What were the impacts on those three critical dimensions? And then what were the outcomes? So we looked at it from the inside out. So now you have very murky waters at the moment. You have, so the new director arriving has to learn that in the EU we've got 50,000 companies will be mandated to follow the double materiality standards of inside out and outside in. Companies following the IASB, the IFRS cannot mandate South Africa to follow the ISSB, for example. And unfortunately, the Financial Reporting Standards Council, which mandated the IASB for us here in South Africa, came to its constitutional end about 2 years ago, and the Minister of Trade and Industry still hasn't reappointed. And it's the name, and it's founded in the Companies Act, it's a statutory body. So its name needs to be changed, International Corporate Reporting Standards Council. And it will have to, I believe, follow what's happening in the rest of the world, mandate sustainability reporting. The question is on what standard? And how do you populate now the Corporate Reporting Standards Council in South Africa? So directors, present and aspirant, have to be aware that there are these enormous changes happening in corporate reporting, and that in the capital markets of the world, the great asset owners and asset managers don't only do a financial due diligence of a company, they do an ESG due diligence of the company. And they follow very much, I think you and I can be proud of the fact, as members of the King Committee, they follow very much that outcomes-based approach to governance. You know, what are you achieving?
No, great. Thanks, Mervyn. Maybe just a last question. You mentioned this earlier on. In fact, today in the press there was talk of this as well, where the mind of the board was doesn't look like it's a collective mind of the board. And I always enjoy your take on that topic of collective mind of the board. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
Yes, pleasure. When you go there as an individual, as a director, but when you make a decision, He's even repaid you, but for some reason the shareholders vote, and particularly when you have a single shareholder, and this is one of the problems with our SOEs, when you have a single shareholder and they say, no, we still want him on the board. Now, you've got a collective mind with the single one, which is not trusted and not dishonest. You've got the board becomes absolutely dysfunctional. I've seen this, I've experienced it. So that's why you put into the MOI, and funny enough, only about 2 months ago, I was consulted by a major company listed on the JSE. And I actually went into the boardroom, and there was a director that was not being part of that collective mind. And they actually had an MOI which gave the board the right to dismiss that director. And they called a board meeting and actually had that as an agenda item. She came and made her story, and the board voted, and she was gone. And that's, I believe, what should happen. Dysfunctionality on a board is when you get that you haven't got that unified mind anymore, and you really have fragmentation of that collective thinking. And that's again where the chairman should be aware of this. And so one of the critical things, Anton, is understanding. So as a chairman, I just learned from experience, and again, Adrian Cadbury and I discussed this, and it's actually in his book on chairmanships, that if I have a board of 12 people and we have a very complicated issue and there's a 30-page management report, I would phone up someone that I think has actually got some knowledge about this. Anton. I'll say, Anton, have you read your pack? Yes, ma'am. I want you to go into it in some detail, because when we just start discussing this, I want you to lead the discussion. Now, the reason for that, I wanted to start the discussion on a more informed basis. We discuss it, and after 45 minutes, I see that the board is inclining to a decision ABC. So I go around the boardroom table. I think he inclining to a decision ABC. Do you agree? Yes, Mr. Chairman. Yes, 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 yes. I'll just pick on one director and say, will you please explain to me in great detail why you voted yes? Now, if he or she has not understood that management report, hasn't followed the 45 minutes of informed discussion, he or she sits there with 2 rows of teeth. And I can tell you something, Anton, diligence / called homework improves. I have my directors on their toes. Nobody speaks across the table and has them. They speak through me. You get absolute control of your board. And you make sure that people are not afraid, because especially the aspirant non-executive director who arrives, he's afraid to say, excuse me, Chair, I don't understand this. Because he doesn't want Joe on his left and Mary on his right to think he's a fool. But he must forget he is the mind of the board. The board is an incapacitated person, has no mind of its own. You, the director, are the mind of the board. So you've got to understand that if you don't understand and you just go along with it, you're actually not carrying out your function.
Yep. Mervyn, as always, absolute pleasure having a discussion with you. Thank you so much for your insights.
My pleasure.
And your range of knowledge. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you, Anton.
Thanks, Mervyn.